The cold wind cut through the helicopter cabin like a knife, as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos felt the hands grab her shoulders. 3,000 feet above the dense Amazon rainforest, with no parachute strapped to her back and nowhere to run, she realized that survival would depend on everything the Rangers had taught her. Except they never taught anyone how to survive being thrown from a helicopter by their own unit. What happened in those terrifying moments between betrayal and impact would test every limit of human endurance, military training, and the will to live. This is the true story of how one woman turned the ultimate act of betrayal into the greatest comeback in military history. Some say Rangers lead the way. Maria Santos was about to prove that Rangers don't need parachutes. They need something far more powerful. The morning started like any other deep reconnaissance mission in the Colombian jungle. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos checked her gear for the third time, her fingers moving with practiced precision over each piece of equipment. The Black Hawk helicopter's engines roared to life on the makeshift landing pad carved out of the rainforest floor. Around her, 5 other Rangers prepared for what their commanding officer, Captain Derek Walsh, had briefed as a routine intelligence-gathering operation near the Venezuelan border. Maria had served with this unit for 18 months. She knew each man's habits, their strengths, their fears. Rodriguez always triple-checked his ammunition. Thompson hummed old country songs under his breath when he was nervous. Jenkins cracked his knuckles in a specific rhythm before every mission. These men were her brothers in arms, bound by the Ranger creed, and countless missions that had brought them home safely. But something felt different this morning. The briefing had been unusually brief. Captain Walsh had avoided eye contact with her, something that had never happened before. The mission coordinates seemed oddly specific for a general reconnaissance, pointing to a remote valley that intelligence reports had marked as empty of cartel activity for months. As the helicopter lifted off, Maria noticed the crew chief, Sergeant First Class Marcus Cole, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Cole had been with the unit longer than anyone. He was the kind of soldier other soldiers looked up to. Decorated for valor in 3 different conflicts. If anyone embodied the Ranger's spirit, it was Marcus Cole. The flight took them deeper into the jungle than she expected. Below, the green canopy stretched endlessly, broken only by rivers that snaked through the landscape like silver threads. The air inside the helicopter was thick with humidity and tension. Nobody was talking, which was unusual. These men typically used flight time to joke, plan, or discuss the mission details. 20 minutes into the flight, Captain Walsh moved from his position and sat across from Maria. His face was hard, emotionless. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the engine noise. "Santos, we need to talk about the missing supplies." Maria's blood went cold. 3 weeks earlier, a supply drop intended for a forward operating base had gone missing. The cargo included medical supplies, ammunition, and equipment worth over $200,000. An investigation was ongoing, but no conclusions had been reached. More importantly, Maria had nothing to do with it. "Sir, I already gave my statement to the investigators. I was on perimeter duty that night. I never went near the supply zone." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "We have evidence that suggests otherwise." Before Maria could respond, Rodriguez and Thompson moved closer. She realized with growing horror that this wasn't a conversation. It was an accusation, and somehow her fellow Rangers had already decided she was guilty. "Evidence?" Maria kept her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. "What evidence?" Cole spoke for the first time since takeoff. "Your fingerprints were found on the cargo manifest." "The one that disappeared with the supplies?" "Of course my prints were on it. I helped load the helicopter that morning. We all did." Maria looked around at the faces of men she had trusted with her life. None of them would meet her eyes except Walsh. "The investigation is ongoing," Walsh said. "But certain facts have come to light. The missing supplies were found at a location only someone with our operational knowledge could have accessed. Someone sold out our position to the cartels." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Maria felt the helicopter bank sharply to the right, changing course from their original flight path. Through the window, she could see they were heading toward a particularly dense section of jungle, far from any established landing zones. "Sir, with all due respect, that's impossible. I've never compromised operational security. I've never betrayed this unit or my country." Thompson finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "The evidence doesn't lie, Santos, and neither do the dead civilians who got caught in the crossfire when the cartels ambushed that supply convoy." Maria's heart sank. She hadn't heard about civilian casualties. If people had died because of the missing supplies, the stakes were much higher than she had realized. But she also knew with absolute certainty that she had nothing to do with it. I didn't do this, she said firmly. Whoever fed you this information is lying. I've served with honor. I've saved lives in this unit. I've bled alongside you. Cole stood up and moved toward the helicopter's open door. The wind whipped through the cabin as he slid it fully open. Maria realized they were flying at nearly 3,000 feet, well above the jungle canopy. Maybe you did serve with honor, Cole said, his voice now hard and unforgiving. But honor doesn't erase betrayal, and betrayal has consequences. The truth hit Maria like a physical blow. This wasn't an investigation. This wasn't about evidence or justice. This was an execution. Her own unit, men she had trusted completely, had decided she was guilty and were prepared to act as judge, jury, and executioner. You can't do this, Maria said, backing away from the open door. There are procedures. Courts-martial. Due process. Walsh laughed bitterly. Due process? For a traitor? People died because of what you did, Santos. Those procedures don't apply to someone who sells out their own people. Maria's mind raced. She thought about the Rangers she had served with in Afghanistan, the civilians she had helped evacuate during Hurricane Maria, the commendations in her service record. None of it mattered now. These men had made their decision based on evidence she had never seen, in a process she had never been part of. Rodriguez and Thompson grabbed her arms. Their grips were firm but not yet violent. She could see conflict in Thompson's eyes, as if part of him wasn't entirely convinced this was the right course of action. Please, Maria said, looking directly at each man. If you're wrong about this, you're about to murder an innocent soldier. Your sister in arms. Someone who has stood beside you in combat. For a moment, Thompson's grip loosened slightly. Rodriguez glanced uncertainly at Walsh. But Cole stepped forward, his face a mask of certainty. Innocent soldiers don't get their fingerprints on stolen supply manifests. Innocent soldiers don't have offshore bank accounts with suspicious deposits. Innocent soldiers don't have contact with known cartel intermediaries. Maria stared at him in shock. What are you talking about? I don't have any offshore accounts. I've never contacted any cartel members. Where is this information coming from? Intelligence sources, Walsh replied tersely. Sources that don't lie. The helicopter suddenly dropped altitude, causing everyone to grab for handholds. Through the open door, Maria could see the jungle rushing up to meet them. Though they were still well above the treetops, Cole checked his watch. We're at the designated coordinates. Designated coordinates. This had been planned. Every detail had been worked out in advance. Maria realized that she had been brought on this mission specifically to be eliminated. The reconnaissance story was complete fiction. Listen to me, Maria said, her voice urgent. Someone is setting me up. Someone who knows our procedures, our security protocols. Think about it. If I were really working with the cartels, would I be stupid enough to leave my fingerprints on evidence? Would I use accounts and contacts that could be traced back to me? She could see doubt creeping into Thompson's expression, but Walsh cut off any discussion. Enough. We have our orders. Justice needs to be served, and it needs to be served today. Orders. Maria realized this went higher than Captain Walsh. Someone in the command structure had authorized this execution. Someone with enough authority to convince a decorated ranger unit to throw one of their own out of a helicopter. As Rodriguez and Thompson dragged her closer to the open door, Maria's military training took over. She analyzed her situation with the cold clarity that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. 3,000 feet above dense jungle. No parachute, no weapons, no allies. But she was still a ranger. Rangers were trained to survive impossible situations. They were taught to turn disadvantages into advantages, to find opportunity in the bleakest circumstances. The wind from the open door was deafening now. Maria could smell the jungle below, earth, vegetation, moisture, and the wild scent of a place where civilization held no sway. If she was going to survive the next few minutes, she would need every piece of survival training she had ever received. Cole gave a hand signal to the pilot. The helicopter began to hover, creating a stable platform for what was about to happen. Any last words? Walsh asked, though his tone suggested this was a formality rather than genuine curiosity. Maria looked each man in the eye one final time. She saw certainty in Walsh and Cole, doubt in Thompson and Rodriguez, and something that might have been regret in Jenkins, who had remained silent throughout the entire encounter. When you find out you were wrong, Maria said clearly, remember this moment. Remember that you threw away everything you swore to uphold as Rangers. Cole nodded to Rodriguez and Thompson. They lifted Maria toward the door. In her final seconds inside the helicopter, Maria's mind became perfectly clear. She remembered her survival instructor at Ranger School, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Major Harrison who had survived being shot down twice in Vietnam. "The ground is not your enemy," Harrison had told them during a particularly brutal training exercise. "Fear is your enemy. Panic is your enemy. The ground is just another obstacle to overcome." As hands pushed her toward the edge, Maria made a decision that would define whether she lived or died. Instead of fighting against the fall, she would use it. Instead of hitting the jungle canopy as a helpless victim, she would meet it as a ranger. The last thing she saw before leaving the helicopter was Thompson's face, twisted with doubt and anguish. Then she was falling, 3,000 feet above a jungle that had swallowed countless people without a trace. But Maria Santos was not countless people. She was a United States Army Ranger. And Rangers, as she was about to prove, don't need parachutes to survive. The fall began. Time seemed to slow as Maria plummeted through the humid air. Her training kicked in immediately, overriding the natural panic response that would kill most people in her situation. She spread her arms and legs to create maximum air resistance, slowing her descent as much as possible while maintaining stability. The helicopter was already banking away, becoming smaller in the vast blue sky above her. She was alone now, falling toward a green ceiling that looked solid from her current altitude, but which she knew consisted of layers of branches, leaves, and gaps that could either save her life or end it instantly. At 2,000 feet, she could begin to make out individual trees. The canopy wasn't uniform. There were taller emergent trees rising above the main forest level, creating a varied topography of green that rushed toward her with terrifying speed. Maria forced herself to study the approaching jungle with tactical precision. She looked for areas where the canopy appeared less dense, where smaller trees might provide a more gradual breaking of her fall. She spotted a section about 200 yards to her left where the forest seemed younger, with smaller trees and more gaps between them. Using techniques learned during paratrooper training, Maria angled her body to drift laterally through the air. It was a desperate maneuver, but it gave her some control over where she would hit the canopy. Every foot of lateral movement could mean the difference between hitting a massive cecropia tree trunk and landing in a cluster of smaller branches that might bend rather than break. At 1,000 feet, individual leaves became visible. The sound of her fall, the rush of air past her body, was joined by the sounds of the jungle itself, birds calling, insects humming, the rustle of wind through countless leaves. It was almost peaceful, if she ignored the fact that she was falling to what everyone would assume was certain death. At 500 feet, Maria could see the complexity of the jungle structure. The canopy wasn't a single layer, but a complex ecosystem with multiple levels. There were gaps, not many, but enough to give her hope that she might find a pathway down through the branches rather than hitting an impenetrable wall of wood. She spotted her target, a section where several smaller trees grew close together, their branches intertwined in a natural web that might distribute the impact of her fall. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option available in the few seconds she had left. At 200 feet, Maria pulled her arms and legs tight to her body, reducing her profile and aiming for a gap between two larger branches. She had one chance to thread the needle, and everything depended on hitting the canopy at exactly the right angle. The first impact came at what felt like 100 miles per hour. A branch caught her shoulder, spinning her slightly but also beginning the process of slowing her descent. Then another branch hit her leg, and another caught her arm. Each impact was painful but also precious. Every collision with the forest was energy being absorbed, speed being reduced. Maria crashed through the upper canopy like a stone through a spiderweb, branches snapping and leaves exploding around her. But the jungle was fighting her fall, each layer of vegetation slowing her descent incrementally. She protected her head with her arms while allowing her body to hit the branches, using them as a natural braking system. 50 feet from the ground, her fall was arrested dramatically by a thick, horizontal branch that caught her across the midsection, knocking the wind from her lungs but preventing her from hitting the forest floor at lethal speed. She hung there for a moment, gasping for air, before the branch creaked ominously and began to bend under her weight. Maria quickly grabbed for smaller branches around her, distributing her weight across multiple supports. The jungle had caught her, but she wasn't safe yet. She was suspended in a web of branches and vines, battered and bleeding, but miraculously alive. As she hung there, catching her breath and assessing her injuries, Maria heard the distant sound of the helicopter fading into the distance. Her former unit was flying away, confident that they had executed a traitor and that justice had been served. They were wrong on both counts. Maria Santos was very much alive, and the real traitor was still out there, probably congratulating himself on successfully framing an innocent soldier. But first, she had to survive the jungle. Then she could worry about clearing her name and finding the person who had orchestrated her attempted murder. Maria began the careful process of climbing down from her precarious perch, moving slowly to avoid disturbing the branches that had saved her life. Every movement sent pain through her battered body, but pain meant she was alive. As her feet finally touched solid ground, Maria allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. She had survived being thrown from a helicopter at 3,000 feet. She had beaten odds that should have been impossible. Now the real challenge began. She was alone in one of the world's most dangerous jungles, with no supplies, no communication, and no way to contact friendly forces. Worse, she was officially dead as far as her unit was concerned, which meant no one would be looking for her. But Maria Santos was a ranger, and rangers, as she had just proven, were very hard to kill. The jungle floor was a cathedral of green shadows and humid air that pressed against Maria's skin like a living thing. She crouched motionless for 15 minutes after landing, listening to the forest around her, waiting for her body to stop shaking from the adrenaline of her impossible survival. Every breath brought the rich scent of decomposing leaves, flowering plants, and the eternal dampness of a place where the sun barely penetrated. Blood trickled from cuts on her arms and face, where branches had torn through her uniform during the fall. Her left shoulder throbbed with what felt like a deep bruise, but probably wasn't broken. More concerning was a gash on her right leg that was deeper than the others, though it had already stopped bleeding actively. She was battered but functional, which was more than anyone had a right to expect after falling 3,000 feet. Maria took inventory of what she had. Her combat knife was still in its sheath, a miracle considering the violence of her descent through the canopy. Her compass had survived, though its case was cracked. She had a small LED flashlight clipped to her vest, a lighter, and about 6 feet of paracord that had somehow not been stripped away during her fall. No food, no water purification tablets, no radio, no medical supplies beyond basic first aid items in her pocket kit. The most dangerous part of her situation wasn't the lack of supplies, it was the lack of time. Captain Walsh and his team would report her death when they returned to base. Within hours, she would officially be a casualty, killed in action during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. No one would question the story too carefully. Combat missions in the Colombian jungle were inherently dangerous, and helicopter accidents were not uncommon. Once she was officially dead, any attempt to return to civilization would be met with suspicion at best, accusations of desertion at worst. Worse still, whoever had framed her would know their plan had succeeded, and would feel safe from discovery. Maria realized she had perhaps 24 hours before her window of opportunity closed forever. But first, she had to survive long enough to reach civilization. The jungle around her was alive with sounds, birds calling from the canopy, insects humming in the undergrowth, and the distant splash of something large moving through water. Maria oriented herself using the sun's position, which she could glimpse through occasional breaks in the forest cover. Based on the helicopter's flight path and the time they had been in the air, she estimated she was roughly 40 miles from the nearest settlement, assuming she could travel in a straight line. 40 miles through Colombian rainforest was a journey that could take weeks under normal circumstances. Maria had less than a day before her death would be officially recorded, making any future rescue or return infinitely more complicated. She began moving north, toward where she remembered seeing a river from the helicopter. Water meant potential transportation, the possibility of fishing, and most importantly, the chance that the river would lead to human habitation. It also meant exposure to the most dangerous predators in the jungle. But Maria couldn't afford to take the safer but slower route through the deep forest. The undergrowth was thick enough that she could only move at about 1 mile per hour, pushing through curtains of vines and stepping carefully over fallen logs that might conceal snakes or other dangers. Every step forward required constant vigilance. For unstable ground, for venomous creatures, for the 100 different ways the jungle could kill someone who made a careless mistake. After 2 hours of difficult travel, Maria heard the sound she had been hoping for. The distant murmur of flowing water. She adjusted her course and pushed through a particularly dense stand of young trees to find herself on the bank of a river about 50 yards wide. The water was brown with sediment but moved with the steady current of a waterway that would eventually reach the Amazon basin. Maria knelt at the water's edge and drank carefully, filtering the water through a piece of fabric torn from her uniform. It tasted of earth and vegetation, but it was clean enough to keep her hydrated. More importantly, she could see fish moving in the slower water near the bank. Small silver shapes that represented potential food if she could figure out how to catch them. Using her knife and some paracord, Maria fashioned a crude spear by lashing the blade to a straight branch she found along the riverbank. Spearfishing required patience and skill, but it was her best option for protein. She waded into the shallow water near a fallen tree where fish seemed to be feeding, and waited motionlessly for an opportunity. 20 minutes later, she successfully speared a fish about the size of her hand. It wasn't much, but combined with some edible plants she had identified along the riverbank, it would provide enough nutrition to keep her moving. She built a small, smokeless fire using dry wood and her lighter, cooked the fish quickly, and extinguished the fire before the smoke could attract unwanted attention. As she ate, Maria planned her next move. Following the river would be faster than traveling through the jungle, but it would also make her more visible to anyone searching for her, assuming anyone was searching. She decided to compromise, staying within sight of the river but traveling through the forest parallel to its course. The afternoon brought new challenges. The temperature soared as the day progressed, turning the jungle into a green furnace. Maria's uniform was soaked with sweat despite the shade provided by the forest canopy. More troubling were the sounds she began to hear behind her, the occasional crack of a branch, the rustle of disturbed vegetation. At first, she attributed the sounds to wildlife. The jungle was full of animals that would naturally be disturbed by her passage. But as the afternoon wore on, the sounds became more regular, more purposeful. Someone or something was following her. Maria found a position behind a large buttress root and waited silently for 10 minutes, watching the forest behind her. She saw movement about 100 yards back, a flash of camouflaged fabric moving through the trees, then another from a slightly different direction. Her blood went cold. Captain Walsh's team hadn't simply thrown her from the helicopter and assumed she was dead. They had come back to verify their work, probably told their superiors that they needed to recover the body for proper military burial. In reality, they were hunting her to finish the job they had started. Maria counted at least 2 pursuers, possibly 3. They were moving carefully but not silently, which suggested they weren't expecting resistance. After all, who could survive a 3,000-foot fall from a helicopter? They were probably looking for a body, not a living, dangerous opponent. This gave Maria an advantage, but not much of one. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in hostile territory with minimal supplies. However, she was also highly trained in unconventional warfare, and the jungle environment favored defense over offense if she could use it properly. She began moving again, but now with a different purpose. Instead of simply trying to reach civilization, she needed to lose her pursuers, or, better yet, eliminate them entirely. The men following her were the same ones who had thrown her from a helicopter based on fabricated evidence. They weren't just threats to her immediate survival. They were obstacles to her ever clearing her name. Maria began laying a trap. She found a section of the forest where the undergrowth was particularly thick, with several fallen trees creating natural choke points that would force anyone following her to take specific routes. She carefully obscured her actual path while creating false trails that would lead her pursuers into positions where she could engage them individually, rather than as a group. Using techniques learned in Cerise school, Maria created pressure traps from bent branches and paracord, designed to alert her to the location of her pursuers rather than to injure them. She needed information more than casualties at this point. If she could isolate one of the men hunting her, she might be able to capture him and learn who was really behind the frame job that had led to her attempted execution. The first trap triggered just before sunset. Maria heard the sharp crack of a branch snapping back into position, followed by a grunt of surprise and some creative cursing. She moved carefully through the forest toward the sound, using the thick vegetation for concealment. Through a gap in the leaves, she saw Rodriguez crouched beside a tree, examining a cut on his arm, where the branch had caught him. He was alone, separated from his teammates by the natural maze of fallen timber and thick growth that characterized this part of the forest. Rodriguez was the youngest member of the unit, only 23 years old, with less than 2 years in the Rangers. He had always seemed to look up to Maria, asking for advice about military procedures and combat techniques. The fact that he was participating in hunting her down was particularly painful. Maria moved closer, using her knife to cut through vines silently, creating a path that would allow her to approach Rodriguez from behind. She needed to capture him, without alerting his teammates, which meant she had to move perfectly. When she was within 10 feet of Rodriguez, Maria made her decision. She burst from concealment, covering the distance between them in 2 quick steps, and pressed her knife against Rodriguez's throat before he could raise his weapon. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe hard," she whispered directly into his ear. "One wrong move and you'll bleed out before your friends can find you." Rodriguez went perfectly still. Maria could feel the tension in his body, The fear that came with suddenly being at the mercy of someone he had assumed was dead. Good, Maria continued quietly. Now we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to answer them truthfully. If you lie to me, if you try to mislead me, if you make any attempt to signal your teammates, I will kill you without hesitation. Do you understand? Rodriguez nodded carefully, mindful of the blade at his throat. Who ordered my execution? Maria asked. I can't, Rodriguez started to say. Maria pressed the knife slightly harder against his skin. Wrong answer. Try again. Colonel Morrison, Rodriguez whispered. The order came from Colonel Morrison. Maria's mind raced. Colonel Morrison was the commanding officer of their forward operating base, a career soldier with an impeccable reputation and 25 years of service. If Morrison had ordered her execution, the conspiracy went much higher than she had imagined. What evidence did Morrison show you? Maria asked. Bank records, Rodriguez replied quietly. Photographs of you meeting with known cartel contacts. Communication intercepts showing you passing information about our operations. Maria felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. The evidence was sophisticated, detailed, and completely fabricated. Someone with access to intelligence resources had created an entire false identity for her, complete with financial records and photographic evidence. Did you ever see the actual communications? The actual photographs? Or just summaries and reports? Rodriguez hesitated. Mostly reports. Morrison said the actual evidence was classified above our security level. And you believed him? Why wouldn't I? Colonel Morrison he's been fighting cartels for 10 years. He's never lied to us before. Maria realized that Rodriguez genuinely believed she was guilty. The evidence had been convincing enough to persuade an entire ranger unit that one of their own was a traitor. Whoever was behind this conspiracy was both sophisticated and patient, creating a frame that would stand up to casual scrutiny. Rodriguez, listen to me carefully. Maria said, I never took cartel money. I never met with cartel contacts. I never betrayed this unit or my country. Someone created false evidence to make it appear that I did. But the bank accounts can be created by someone with the right resources and access. The photographs can be fabricated. The communications can be faked. Maria kept her voice calm and reasonable. Think about it, Rodriguez. Have I ever done anything in the 18 months you've known me that suggested I was capable of betrayal? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was uncertain. No. You saved Thompson's life in Cartagena. You could have let him die if you were working for the cartels. And yet you helped throw me from a helicopter. Colonel Morrison said you were a clear and present danger to the unit. He said if we didn't act immediately, more people would die. Maria heard voices in the distance, Rodriguez's teammates calling his name. They had noticed he was missing and were beginning to search for him. Here's what's going to happen, Maria said quickly. I'm going to disappear into this jungle, and you're going to tell your team that you got turned around and lost the trail. You're going to recommend that they call off the search because there's no way anyone could have survived that fall. They'll never believe that. Make them believe it, because if they keep hunting me, I will be forced to defend myself. And unlike you, I know this jungle. I know how to kill people quietly in terrain like this. Your friends will start disappearing one by one, and you'll never even see me coming. Rodriguez swallowed hard. What about clearing your name? What about finding out who really betrayed the unit? That's my problem to solve, Maria replied. Your problem is convincing your teammates to go home and leave me alone. She heard footsteps approaching through the undergrowth, still distant but getting closer. Rodriguez! Thompson's voice carried through the trees. Where are you? Maria removed the knife from Rodriguez's throat but kept it ready. Remember what I said. If you value your life and the lives of your teammates, convince them to leave. If I see any of you again, I won't be so merciful. She melted back into the jungle, leaving Rodriguez sitting beside the fallen tree with a thin line of blood on his throat and a lot to think about. From her concealed position 30 yards away, Maria watched as Thompson and Jenkins found Rodriguez. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Rodriguez gesturing animatedly, pointing in different directions, shaking his head. After 15 minutes of discussion, the three men began moving back the way they had come. Rodriguez had convinced them to abandon the search. As darkness fell over the jungle, Maria allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic for the first time since being thrown from the helicopter. She was still alive, she had avoided immediate capture, and she had learned valuable information about the conspiracy against her. Colonel Morrison was involved, which meant the corruption went high into the command structure. Someone with significant resources and access to classified information had orchestrated her frame-up. Most importantly, the evidence against her was fabricated, which meant there might be ways to prove her innocence if she could survive long enough to investigate. Maria found a defensible position among some large rocks and settled in for the night. She had no fire, no shelter, and limited food, but she was alive and free. Tomorrow, she would begin the long journey toward clearing her name and finding the real traitor who had nearly cost her everything. The jungle around her was full of sounds. Night birds calling, insects chirping, the distant splash of something large moving through water. But Maria was no longer afraid of the jungle. She was afraid of the men who had betrayed her, and she was angry enough to make them pay for it. She was going to survive this ordeal. And then she was going to find out who had tried to destroy her life and make sure they faced consequences for their actions. The hunt had begun, but now Maria Santos was the hunter. 3 days after falling from the helicopter, Maria Santos emerged from the Colombian jungle looking like a ghost returning from the dead. Her uniform was torn and stained with mud, her face was scratched and lean from limited food, and her eyes held the hard gleam of someone who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. She stood at the edge of a small village called San Miguel, watching children play soccer in the dusty street while their mothers hung laundry in the morning sun. The journey from her confrontation with Rodriguez to this moment had been a brutal test of everything she had learned about survival. She had followed the river for 2 days, moving mostly at night to avoid detection, eating fish when she could catch them, and edible plants when she couldn't. Her uniform had provided some protection from insects and thorns, but she was covered in bites and cuts that itched constantly in the humid heat. More challenging than the physical hardships was the mental struggle of being declared dead while very much alive. Maria had no identification, no money, no way to prove who she was to suspicious villagers. Worse, approaching any official Colombian authority would likely result in her being returned to the same American military command structure that had ordered her execution. She needed a different approach. Maria spent the morning observing the village, learning its rhythms and identifying potential allies. San Miguel was clearly poor but well organized, with clean streets and evidence of community cooperation. The people moved with purpose rather than fear, suggesting that local cartel influence was minimal. This was important. Maria needed help from people who weren't connected to the criminal networks that her unit had been fighting. Around noon, she approached an elderly woman who was tending a small garden behind the village's only church. The woman looked up as Maria emerged from the tree line, her expression changing from surprise to concern as she took in Maria's battered appearance.
"Ayuda," Maria said in her basic Spanish, holding up her hands to show she was unarmed.
Help. The woman who introduced herself as Esperanza listened patiently as Maria explained her situation in broken Spanish supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dirt. Maria told her the truth, that she was an American soldier who had been betrayed by her own unit and left for dead in the jungle. She needed to reach the American embassy in Bogotá to clear her name and expose the people who had tried to kill her. Esperanza studied Maria's face for a long time, as if reading something there that words couldn't convey. Finally, she nodded and invited Maria into her small house behind the church. Over the next several hours, Esperanza fed Maria the first real meal she had eaten since being thrown from the helicopter: rice, beans, chicken, and fresh fruit that tasted like the finest cuisine after 3 days of survival rations. More importantly, she listened to Maria's story and believed it. "Mi hijo," Esperanza said, referring to her son Miguel. "He drives truck to Bogotá every week. Supplies for the city. He leaves tomorrow morning." Maria felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. Accepting help meant trusting these people with her life, but she had little choice. Walking to Bogotá would take weeks, assuming she could even navigate the mountain roads safely. That evening, Miguel returned to the village in his battered but functional truck. He was a man in his 30s with calloused hands and intelligent eyes, who listened to his mother's explanation without interruption. When Esperanza finished speaking, Miguel studied Maria carefully. "You are American military," he said in accented but clear English. "Yes," Maria replied, surprised by his language skills. "I was translator for American forces in Iraq," Miguel explained. "Two tours. I know military people. I can tell when someone is telling truth about military service." This was an unexpected stroke of luck. Miguel not only spoke English well enough to understand her complete story, but he had experience working with American forces and could potentially vouch for her credibility. Maria told Miguel everything: the missing supplies, The fabricated evidence, the helicopter execution, her survival and escape. Miguel listened without comment, occasionally asking specific questions about military procedures and protocols that verified her knowledge and experience. The evidence against you, Miguel said when she finished. Someone with high access created this, yes? Has to be, Maria confirmed. The bank records, the photographs, the communication intercepts. That level of fabrication requires significant resources and inside knowledge of our operations.
Miguel nodded thoughtfully. In Iraq, I saw this type of corruption.
American officers working with local criminals creating false evidence against people who discovered their activities. Very sophisticated, very dangerous. You believe me, I believe you. Question is, how do we prove your innocence when the people investigating you are part of the conspiracy? It was the same question that had been haunting Maria since her conversation with Rodriguez. Going through normal military channels would be useless if Colonel Morrison was involved. He could simply claim she was a deserter who had fabricated a story to cover her disappearance. Her word against his would not be a fair contest. The American Embassy, Maria said. If I can reach someone there who isn't connected to military intelligence, maybe they can help investigate independently. Miguel considered this. Embassy people in Bogotá are mostly diplomatic staff, not military. They might be more willing to listen, but getting there safely is the problem. They spent the evening planning Maria's journey to Bogotá. Miguel's truck route would take him through several military checkpoints where Maria's presence could create problems. They decided she would hide among his cargo bags of coffee beans destined for export, and Miguel would present papers showing he was traveling alone. The greater risk was that Colonel Morrison's people might be watching for her at the embassy, assuming she had somehow survived. Maria needed a way to approach embassy staff without exposing herself to potential military personnel who might recognize her. Miguel had a solution for this as well. His uncle Carlos worked as a maintenance supervisor at the embassy and could potentially arrange a private meeting with diplomatic staff away from military personnel. It wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was better than walking through the front door and hoping for the best. They left San Miguel before dawn, Maria hidden among coffee bags in the back of Miguel's truck. The ride was uncomfortable and nerve-wracking, especially when they reached the first military checkpoint. Maria could hear voices outside the truck as Colombian soldiers examined Miguel's papers and asked routine questions about his cargo. Just coffee beans for export, Miguel replied calmly. Same route I drive every week. The soldiers seemed satisfied with his answers. Maria heard footsteps walking around the truck, but no one opened the cargo area to inspect the load. After a few more minutes of conversation, the truck started moving again. They encountered 2 more checkpoints during the 8-hour journey to Bogotá, but each one followed the same pattern. Miguel was known to the guards as a regular driver. His papers were in order, and they had no reason to suspect he was carrying anything more dangerous than coffee beans. The city of Bogotá appeared gradually as they descended from the mountains, first as a haze of smog and distant buildings, then as an increasingly dense collection of neighborhoods that eventually merged into the urban landscape of Colombia's capital. Maria had never been so happy to see civilization. Miguel drove directly to his uncle's house in a working-class neighborhood about 30 minutes from the embassy district. Carlos turned out to be a man in his 50s with the practical demeanor of someone who had spent his life solving other people's problems. He listened to Maria's story with the same careful attention his nephew had shown, asking pointed questions about her military background that convinced him she was telling the truth. Embassy security is very tight, Carlos explained, but maintenance staff can move around building without much attention. I can get you inside after hours when most diplomatic staff have gone home, but you will have only one chance to make your case. That evening, Carlos provided Maria with civilian clothes and helped her clean up enough to look presentable rather than like someone who had been living in the jungle. Looking in the mirror for the first time since her ordeal began, Maria was shocked by her appearance. She had lost weight. Her face was drawn and marked with healing cuts, and her eyes had a hardness that hadn't been there a week earlier. You look like someone who has been through war, Carlos observed. I have been, Maria replied. I just never expected the enemy to be wearing the same uniform I was. That night, Carlos brought Maria through a service entrance to the embassy, using his security credentials. The building was mostly empty, with only security guards and a few duty officers remaining on the premises. Carlos led her through maintenance corridors to a small conference room near the administrative offices. Wait here, he instructed. I will find someone who can help you. 20 minutes later, Carlos returned with a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Susan Martinez, Deputy Chief of Mission for Political Affairs. Martinez listened skeptically as Maria explained her situation, clearly struggling to believe that a decorated U.S. Army Ranger was sitting in her conference room claiming to have been executed by her own unit and left for dead in the Colombian jungle. "You understand how extraordinary this sounds?" Martinez said when Maria finished her account. "You're asking me to believe that American military officers attempted to murder one of their own soldiers based on fabricated evidence." "I know how it sounds," Maria replied, "but I can prove everything I'm telling you. The evidence against me was manufactured by someone with high-level access to classified information and significant financial resources. If you investigate independently of military channels, you'll find inconsistencies that will expose the conspiracy." Martinez studied Maria's face carefully. "What do you need from me?" "Help me contact the FBI or another civilian law enforcement agency that can investigate without interference from military intelligence. And protection while the investigation is ongoing. If Colonel Morrison's people find me before I can prove my innocence, they'll finish the job they started." Martinez was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of Maria's request. Finally, she nodded. "I'm going to make some phone calls. If your story checks out, we'll find a way to help you." If it doesn't, she left the threat unspoken, but Maria understood the message. Over the next 48 hours, Maria remained hidden in a safe house arranged by embassy security, while Martinez made discreet inquiries through civilian law enforcement channels. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed, partly because Maria's story was so specific and verifiable, and partly because the FBI had already been investigating irregularities in military supply contracts in South America. The breakthrough came when FBI forensic accountants discovered that the bank accounts, supposedly belonging to Maria, had been created using stolen identity information and funded through a complex network of shell companies. The photographs showing her meeting with cartel contacts were sophisticated digital fabrications that could only have been created by someone with access to classified surveillance photos of actual cartel members. Most damaging to the conspiracy was the discovery that Colonel Morrison had been receiving payments from the same shell companies that had funded Maria's fabricated bank accounts. The man who had ordered her execution was himself the traitor he had accused her of being. When FBI agents arrested Morrison at his Ford operating base, they found evidence of a comprehensive scheme to steal military supplies and sell them to criminal organizations throughout South America. Morrison had been running the operation for over 2 years, using his position to identify and eliminate anyone who might discover his activities. Maria's fate had been sealed when she began asking questions about the missing supply drop. Morrison couldn't afford to have a competent, honest soldier investigating his operation, so he had decided to frame her for his own crimes and eliminate her permanently. Captain Walsh, Rodriguez, Thompson, and the other Rangers who had participated in Maria's attempted execution were all arrested and charged with attempted murder. Their defense was that they had been following orders from a superior officer based on evidence they believed to be legitimate, but the legal system was not sympathetic to soldiers who threw their comrades from helicopters without due process. 3 months after falling from the helicopter over the Colombian jungle, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood in a military courtroom and watched as Colonel Morrison was sentenced to life in prison for treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Captain Walsh received 25 years. The other members of her unit received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of participation in the conspiracy. Maria herself was fully exonerated and awarded the Soldier's Medal for her courage in exposing the corruption within her unit. She was offered promotion, reassignment to any unit she preferred, and full recognition for her service and sacrifice. Instead, Maria chose to retire from the army. "I joined the military to serve something greater than myself," she explained to the reporter who interviewed her about her experience. "But when the institution I served tried to murder me to cover up its own corruption, something fundamental broke. I still believe in the values the military is supposed to represent, but I can't serve in a system where those values can be so completely betrayed." Today, Maria Santos works as a private investigator specializing in military justice cases. She helps soldiers who find themselves caught up in corruption or facing false accusations, using the skills and experience gained during her ordeal to protect people who might otherwise be destroyed by the same kind of conspiracy that nearly cost her everything. She never returned to the Colombian jungle, but she keeps in touch with Miguel and his family in San Miguel, the people who helped her survive when survival seemed impossible. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is strong enough, she thinks about falling 3,000 feet through empty air and discovering that Rangers really don't need parachutes to survive. They need something much more powerful. They need the unbreakable conviction that justice will eventually win, that truth will eventually surface, and that even when everything seems lost, the fight is never really over. Maria Santos fell from a helicopter and lived to tell the story. But more importantly, she fell from grace and climbed back up to clear her name and expose the people who had betrayed everything they had sworn to protect. In the end, that was the real victory. Not surviving the fall, but surviving what came after, and using that survival to make sure the same thing could never happen to anyone else. Rangers lead the way. Maria learnt during her darkest hour. Even when the way forward seems impossible, especially then,